Good morning. I hope you had a good coffee and are ready for some interesting discussions on a very interesting topic. My name, for those of you that don't know me, I am Josh Roberts. I'm the Advocacy Officer for RECs EU. And it is my honor to welcome you all as people who have at least a remote interest in the topic of energy communities to a workshop to discuss how we are going to actually put the new clean energy package provisions on them into practice. So what I would like to do first is just for some housekeeping. So we're going to do this. I'm going to give a presentation and then a discussion. I think all of you have been invited here today, not just to listen to us. We basically, the context of this project between RECs EU and Coherent has been that we have been working on this for a very long time. We inputted into the proposals of the Commission on this topic, and we followed the negotiations. And we have been devising what we think are good solutions. But this workshop is not necessarily about us providing you guys with what we think should be happening in the transposition. It's also to gain information and insights from you as to what are your positions, where do you think the challenges are, and some of your ideas as well. So we would very much appreciate the opportunity to have rank discussions. If you would like to use social media, I encourage it, but I think it would also be nice to have as frank a conversation as possible. So if you agree, we could agree to a Chatham House rules where we don't attribute anybody to a specific position or statement. We do have some ministries here, so it would be nice to get their ideas. And if we just start shouting out things, maybe this would somehow stifle some debate that we could have. Also, just to let you know, we are recording this via webinar. We will not be distributing this publicly, but we will be sharing it with you and with people who are attending virtually. Because many of our members, RECs EU, could not join, but we thought that it would be valuable for them to have this discussion. So first of all, what I would like to do is maybe just a very, very quick tour de table. If you could just say your name, your organization, and what your role is. And maybe we can start here. Yeah. Oh, and really quick, if there are microphones, so if you would like to use it, just make sure that you press the button to activate it, and when you are done, please deactivate it. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Carlota. I'm an environmental lawyer from ITMA working on energy issues in Spain.
My name is Guillermo. I also work for ITMA, also work in energy for Spain.
I'm Sara Capuzzo, I'm a nostra president. A nostra is RECs Group.
I am Emilio Sani. I am a lawyer. I am the director of Nostra and director of Italia Solares, that is one organization that aggregates the Italian producer from PV plants.
Hello, I'm Vito Dosha and I work for Can Europe as energy policy coordinator.
Hello, I'm Rachel. I'm here as a representative of the Bridge Task Force on Energy Communities, an initiative by Teach for Energy, and as a PhD student also studying the topic of energy communities.
Hi, I'm Laton. I'm working as a consultant in decentralized energy system.
Hello, Jesus Contreras. I'm also at the NG Impact working as a consultant.
Hello, my name is Gina Stewart. I'm working as a legal counsel at Personal Government. I'm working on the transportation of the energy package.
Hi, hello, I'm Daria Brun. I work for EASME, an executive agency that manages the energy efficiency part of Horizon 2020, and we have a number of energy communities.
Hi, I'm Florian Hildebrand from EREF, European Renewable Energies Federation, and the work is Junior Policy Advisor.
I'm Chris Moller from the Scope of Flanders, it's the Federation of Scopes in the Flanders region.
Hello, I'm Tom Willems. I'm working for EcoPower and also for Scope Flanders.
My name is Jamie Ganana. I'm coordinator of EcoPower. EcoPower is a RESCOPE member of RESCOPE EU.
So I'm in Russia. I work for ATS Energy Efficiency Services, European Association.
Hello, I'm Alessia Begini, Policy Officer also at the European Federation of Energy Efficiency Services.
Hello, my name is Elena Donaria. I work for the Council of European Energy Regulators, and I coordinate the customers and retail market working groups. I'm Elena Samantha from the Ministry of Energy from Lithuania, and I'm responsible for renewable energy. Good morning, I'm Carla Rui. I'm an energy lawyer from Spain, and I come on behalf of Coherent, which is a European User Association.
Good morning, I'm Stein Louis, European Commission, DG Energy. I'm from the Renewables Unit at the contact point for Renewable Energy Communities and
Hi, good morning. I'm Manuela Rose, also from the European Commission DG Energy, but in the Group 3 unit on retail market and working on citizens energy.
Hi, I'm Charlotte Hansen. I'm a lawyer at Client and I'm working on decentralized energy issues and
Hello, I'm Marta Coherent. I work for Client and currently I'm working on the Horizon 2020 project called Oversight, which is about consumers and energy communities.
Good morning to everybody. I'm Anna Portfolio representative of the National Confederation of Italian Cooperatives.
Hello, good morning. My name is Antonio Amato. I'm the National Director of the Federation of Consumer Cooperatives and Electric Cooperatives in Cooperative in Italy. Thank you.
All right. Thank you very much for that. It sounds like we have a very diverse group here, so that is good. Time is wasting, so I won't waste any more time. We're going to go through 3 topics today, basically. First, it's always most important. We all need to understand what we are talking about. So we will go into the definitions, the new definitions of renewable energy community, which can be found in the Renewables Directive, and the definition of energy community, citizen energy community in the Electricity Directive. We will also cover a couple of the other somewhat related definitions and discuss how they might relate. A lot of this will be around design questions. I would say not all the topics we will discuss today will get super technical. I think a lot of the things that we're talking today are still at a more design level, but the definitions are certainly one that we can go into more detail on. And just to give you a scope of what we are covering today, largely it is the Renewable Energy Directive, the Electricity Directive, and in some cases the Electricity Regulation. Those are the core pieces of legislation inside the clean energy package that concern energy communities the most. The definitions, of course, not just because we need to understand what we are talking about, but this is a very complex issue. Some member states have a good idea of what an energy community is for them. For instance, in Germany and in Denmark, energy communities have been around basically since electrification or heatification. Renewable energy communities have been around since the 70s. They literally pioneered the first wind turbines. So some member states, some stakeholders have a good notion of what this is, but a lot, they do not. They either have a growing industry or they have nothing at all. And again, the definitions themselves, the language, since this is contained in a directive, it is fairly principle-based, and it does give member states a lot of discretion as to how they implement that at national level. So it really does raise a lot of conceptual and technical questions that need to be answered as we go along. So that's really what we're tackling right now. Just to give you a quick run-through of the presentation before I get into the thick of it. First, I'm just going to give an introduction of the definition itself, to give some sort of defining parameters of what we are talking about. Then I will attempt to go quickly through each element of the definition, and then touch upon some of the activity-related definitions, and then highlight at the very end some of the more notable issues that we are seeing in the transposition process, and give some of our insights about how those could be dealt with. And then at the very end, we can have some recommendations and then some discussion afterwards. So first off, yes, as I mentioned before, we have two definitions. One of the very first questions is, what is the relationship between the definitions? And I will get back to some of the issues around that, practically speaking, but generally, what we are talking about, and initially, there was no difference between when we started advocating for an acknowledgement, we didn't really want any difference. It's the same concept, really. And because of the legislative process, because you had different silos of negotiations going on, there were, and the way they evolved, they didn't necessarily align completely, but by and large, if you look at them, they are sort of the same core concept. They both must be legal entity, and they both have sort of the more or less the same purpose and aims, which you could sort of summarize as a non-commercial purpose. There are several aspects of the renewable energy community definition which are more narrow, and a lot of that has to do with governance and participation requirements, and even in certain technologies that really make a renewable energy community more of a subset of citizen energy community. Citizen energy communities are really about participating across the electricity sector, and renewable energies is focusing specifically on renewable energy itself. Of course, it can go beyond electricity. It can also go to gas and heating. So again, this isn't just this is not a rigid relationship. It's just to give you a good idea. And if you look at the definitions themselves, the criteria, they are really composed of criteria. So when you're looking, is a certain legal entity an energy community? The first thing you should be asking yourself is, does it meet the criteria? And so that is kind of where to paint a picture in your mind, if you will. So first, the second question comes into, well, okay, what type of legal entities are we talking about here? I sort of listed a couple of relevant practical questions that people are asking themselves, or should be asking themselves. And one of the first things is, if you have existing energy communities, what legal entities are they actually using? What exists? Because ultimately, we're not trying to rock the boat for people who are already part of this industry. We want it to grow around them so that they can be replicated and so that we can have innovation. And when it comes to innovation, then you can also ask yourself, okay, if these are supposed to be non-commercial entities, what type of other legal entities might be interesting? And that could be anywhere from sort of group housing, shared housing complexes. Sometimes those have quasi or official legal entities, but you also have a lot of social enterprises which may focus on, poverty or other social issues, which could be useful. Nonprofit associations, this type of thing. It's always going to differ, but there might be things that people haven't thought of. And then, of course, you want to ask yourself, do we want this to be open-ended, or do we want to focus a definition around legal entities that are likely to share the same purpose or characteristics as what we have in the definition? So this is just this is a report that when I was with Client Earth in 2012 we did. So this is a very old report, but it really provides a good basis for looking at what already exists. So we already, depending on the country, had a number of existing legal entities that certain communities use to undertake any sort of number of projects. It's not just about renewables, it's really across the energy sector. But then there is also a very interesting it's a European project. I can't remember the name, I couldn't find it before the presentation. But the report was basically there. The project was looking at different social enterprises across Europe and their environments. And what you see here is you have a lot of legal entities that have been used. may not necessarily already be used for energy communities, but might have a social purpose that could be useful. So when you are looking at this, this is something key to recognize. Of course, a member state could just say, yes, we want to have a legal entity. And basically from this, we have, I would say, there are three options you could really go for. The first is just a criteria-based approach. That is simply to say, any legal entity that meets the criteria can be an energy community. And then if you wanted to go again beyond that, you could say, okay, what are our existing legal forms, or what other legal forms might we want to use? And then in that case, you would identify a sort of concrete set of legal entities that you would want to be an energy community. Of course, in your legislation, you would want to say that the use of these legal entities would not be, would still need to meet the criteria. It's not that you just have a legal entity that is automatically the job is done. Ultimately, you need to be meeting the criteria. And there is a third option, which is a new legal form. Do you want to create a brand new legal form for energy communities? I think this is an interesting idea, but I think depending on where you are already at in your development of community energy at national level, each of these three ideas may be more interesting. Just to give you an idea of what has actually been used so far, several member states have opted for the first approach, that is the criteria-based approach. You see France, Ireland, Wallonia, and Luxembourg in their draft law have sort of not stated any specific legal entity. In Denmark and Flanders, they are not actually in their legislative processes yet. They're developing guidance or recommendations from authorities, and they have suggested certain entities that have already been used by the community energy sector for a while. You'll notice cooperatives and associations, they often come into play, public entities as well, or nonprofits. And in Lithuania, even in their national draft law, they have also mentioned sort of the same. In Greece, where they literally started with nothing, they embarked on a very unique, new, broad ranging legislation on energy communities. They adopted a new legal form, which is, it is a cooperative, but it focuses solely on the energy sector. So it's de facto an energy cooperative. I think my preference would probably be for approach 2. I think you do want to, I don't necessarily think it needs to be open-ended, because you might end up getting some legal entities that you don't necessarily want. The for-profit driven commercial enterprise models may not, it will allow innovation, but it might not necessarily be productive, because at the end of the day, and I will get to this at the end, you will have to oversee, somebody will have to oversee whether these criteria are met. I think option 3, in my view, is interesting if you do not have any energy communities in place. So if you're really starting from scratch and you want to develop something unique, I think this could be interesting. If you already have some energy communities in place, this might not make sense, because it could sort of rock the boat, so to speak. So moving on to the actual criteria, again, the purpose, this is very important. This is one of the main distinguishing aspects of energy communities vis-a-vis other traditional energy market players. And you see there, it's about environmental, economic, and social community benefits. There are really 2 aspects of this. One is about the mutual interest for the members. So these benefits could be delivered for the members, but they could also be for the local area where they operate. And that is a more of a general interest. What I would say is the first, when it's more members-based, this is really talking about like cooperatives. And the other more general interest is more about social enterprises. So depending on it was meant to sort of address both of those areas of types of entities. And really, I think some of the member states they are copying and pasting this, which is fine, but I would actually say that could be a lot more concrete on what are the actual benefits. So what is a social benefit? Could it be energy poverty or solidarity? Could it be about promoting education around energy issue? or even just empowering citizens to participate in the energy transition and take ownership of production or services. Economic benefits also the same. There's a lot of questions about how much return in investment could an energy community give to individuals. I don't think there's a hard answer on that, but in a lot of cooperative laws, for instance, you have a limit on return on investment. The directives are fairly clear that the aim should not be to provide a return on investment or a profit to the shareholders. It's about reinvesting the profits into the activities and to promoting the certain benefits. Again, where are some of the member states on this? I would say largely there hasn't been a lot of innovation so far that we've seen. Greece certainly goes the furthest. There were several specific aims that they had in mind, and one of the strong and most interesting aims here was about promoting a solidarity economy and tackling energy poverty. Of course, they give a lot of they sort of mix activities with aims, and one is about a means to achieve the other. But it does provide some interesting ideas. In Ireland, they added societal benefits into their RES framework. It's a national support scheme, so it's not maybe the basis for their transposition, but it does provide a basis for renewable energy communities to participate in support schemes. In terms of participation, this really covers the openness and voluntary. So what is openness? Well, in the recitals of at least the Renewables Directive, they talk about openness about allowing any member that wants to join based on non-discriminatory criteria. That doesn't mean there can't be concrete criteria, for instance, minimum investment requirements. And what I would say is probably most important here to acknowledge is that depending on the activity, openness will differ. So for instance, for a renewable energy project, if you just have setting up a community for like a wind farm, if you're conducting a share offer, the share offer doesn't last forever. Once the share offer is over and you've raised your funds, you're going to close it. So openness will be limited in time. If it's a collective self-consumption or an energy sharing scheme or even a district network, you're not just going to let somebody from across the country become a member of your network. You should probably have a connection. So one thing that we would urge is to look at the context. This is not something that can just be treated in a broad manner. It needs to be context specific. For voluntary participation, this is really about your ability to lead. So you should be able to come, but you should also be able to lead. And there are two important aspects to realize in this. One is from the consumer perspective. One thing the directives are very clear is that as a participant, everybody maintains their consumer rights and obligations. And one of the rights is the ability to choose your supplier. So this is one of the most important aspects of this. So EU legislation is already fairly clear on this, so that applies. The other aspect, though, here is from an investment or shareholder perspective. How can you lead the community? If I don't want to be a part of this, how do I get my money out and I just leave? A lot of this is already detailed in company laws or cooperative laws, and oftentimes entities are given discretion within their statutes of incorporation to decide these issues. Interestingly enough, Luxembourg in their draft law have stated that members must have the right to leave that should not exceed 1 year, although they have given discretion to communities to organize themselves as they see fit. That is really the only reference that we've seen so far for national legislation. So it has yet to be seen how that might actually be carried out. I'm not sure if people just are not really paying attention to it so far, but by and large, it's kind of being left out of the conversation. Another important aspect here is about effective control. So between the two definitions, the standard for effective control differs. For renewable energy communities, they are very locally based, and so effective control must be with local members. And that raises an issue around proximity, which I will get to in a second. But for citizen energy communities, effective control is about the size of the participant. So For instance, if you are a medium or a large enterprise, you would not be allowed to effectively control that. So what is control? The electricity directive does define control, but I also wonder in my mind, and I would be interested in others' perspectives on this, control in the electricity directive really has to do with ownership unbundling. I do think that as a standard, it does have a lot of significance for this, but I also just sort of put an understanding here of what is control, and largely it's going to be defined in national company laws, but it is about really the relationship between a member within the community, regardless of whether it's how much shares they have, whether they've entered into agreements with other shareholders, to give them not necessarily a majority, but a significant influence to make decisions or to appoint or remove certain board members and this type of thing. So it's not concrete. There are a lot of examples of how this has been implemented. I'm not going to go through all of these because that would take too long. But again, I think in terms of effective control for renewable energy communities, a lot of member states have already tried to figure out what is the proper proximity for having effective control. It has ranged everywhere from regions or neighboring regions in Greece, and this has a lot to do with their net metering, collective self-consumption schemes that they've developed. Others are suggesting a municipality approach or a neighboring municipality approach. I think generally speaking, we would urge not to create too narrow. Otherwise, it may be hard to get these communities off the ground. Of course, you don't want it to be too large either, or else they're not really communities, at least for renewable energy communities. In Luxembourg, it's a very technical definition, and it's based on injection points related to the area that is operated around the TSO. I do believe that is because the certain construction of what is a renewable energy community has been really framed around the activity of collective self-consumption, and we will get to that in a second. And in Ireland, interestingly, their new framework for support schemes really is about local ownership, 51% ownership, the ability to appoint members of the board, etc. I think this is not part of transposition, but it is an example that we can point to, which sort of covers all the situations that you might be thinking about when you're looking at control. It really talks about everything from the amount of capital or voting rights that an individual member might have, all the way to different decisions or agreements that one shareholder might come to with another shareholder to affect the decision making of that. I think one of the big aspects that we are concerned about here is ensuring that larger members, such as companies, are not able to sort of finagle their way into a controlling position, either through a minority but a significant minority shareholding, or through a subsidiary where they're connected through different enterprises. And the last one here, autonomy, this is also about the governance. It is similar to effective control, but what it is really about is about ensuring that the entity itself is autonomous from both first individual members, to make sure that an individual member is not able to use the community for its own benefit, and to ensure that partners or financiers that enter into agreements with the community are not somehow able to control it based on their business relationship. A lot of communities will limit the amount of shares that a certain individual member can have, and some have even gone so far as to implement a one person, one vote to ensure a more democratic way of decision making, and we certainly think that that is a good way to go here. And there's actually a definition of what is an autonomous enterprise. This also has to do with being linked to other enterprises. This is in the Commission recommendation on the definition of small and medium enterprises. I think it is worth looking at. And the last one, this is very simple, is eligibility. It is quite straightforward. If you look at the definitions, they say who is eligible to participate. Natural persons, local authorities, always able to participate. In a renewable energy community, if you are bigger than a medium-sized enterprise, you are not able to participate. Citizen energy communities allow any size of enterprise to participate. There is a bit of an issue here with regard to language in Article 22, which essentially gives a right of all final consumers to participate in a renewable energy community, although it does qualify that language for private undertakings that have energy as their primary business. This has been interpreted by some as prohibiting these enterprises from participating. We have a different interpretation. We think that it gives member states the discretion about whether to allow such enterprises to participate or not. There can be benefits of having professionalized energy companies as a participant or member of the community. For instance, in France, a lot of enterprises have brought their expertise along with their membership, and they are simply, because it's one person, one vote, there's very little risk of them actually taking that over. So I think, interestingly, France has actually prohibited such enterprises from participating, and even some member states in their definitions have limited eligibility only to local participants for renewable energy communities. So you see some member states tinkering with this to sort of make sure that they stay local and that there is a separation. I think we are urging. I don't know if we have a position on this issue, but I think it depends. If you think it's okay and you're not afraid of risks for abuse, then maybe it's interesting. If there are more worries for risks, then maybe you want to limit. So maybe just the last 5 minutes to get into some of the challenges that we are hearing about and how to maybe address them. The first is how to address activities. So one of the most widely talked about notions of an energy community is what are they doing? And the answer always depends. For many people, the answer relates to what they are doing. So if you are developing models for collective self-consumption or energy sharing or microgrids, an energy community is simply this end of story. However, as we saw before, the definitions of energy communities are around organizational criteria. The definitions of energy communities do not relate, and energy communities themselves are not about a specific activity. Here we have just sort of, this is, these are sort of the ideas about what activities energy communities could participate in. And if you look at these, I mean, they're hard to see from your seats, but it's really, when you look at them, it's about participating across the energy sector. And if you connect these to the rights that energy communities have in their respective provisions, they have a right to participate and access all suitable markets, either individually or via a third party. This really broadens it out. So it's not just about collective self-consumption or a specific activity. We have a couple of member states that have sort of embarked on this broad understanding. In Greece's law on energy communities, they include almost everything, which is really interesting. And I think that's a very good way to start, because you do want them to be able to innovate in new activities. You don't want to simply limit them to one single thing. And in Lithuania, they've also sort of done this, and they have integrated heat. We always talk about electricity, but if you talk about community networks, customer-owned networks, district heating really kind of elevates in terms of its importance for enabling citizen involvement and for decarbonization as well. So I think that is something, obviously it depends on your country's circumstance. Again, this is kind of just to sort of clarify, because a lot of the discussions have hovered around renewable self-consumption. Several member states' transposition so far, their definitions of energy communities have really focused on an energy community is collective self-consumption. Here, just to sort of dispel that narrow notion, collective self-consumption and renewable self-consumption generally is governed by as an activity in a different article than renewable energy communities. And so we see this as an opportunity my time is done, so I need to wrap it up. As an opportunity for everyone else, similar to everyone else. And I think that's really important. We don't want collective self-consumption to be sort of hand-tied, that they have to develop as a renewable energy community. These are opportunities that are available to any market actor, whether they're commercial or non-commercial. So I think that's very important. This might get too confusing, but I think if you look at it, you could go quite crazy with how you look at your definitions. But this is just to sort of bring the point home that you don't want one simple definition. You could even have several definitions. In Ireland, in their support scheme, they do have a definition of renewable energy community, but then they also have a definition for community-led projects. And it is those community-led projects that get certain advantages in their support scheme. So this is contextualizing. You might want community collective self-consumption. So a lot of member states like Portugal or Wallonia, where they have sort of already embarked on this process, you don't necessarily need to start from scratch, but you can use that as a basis and then create a broader umbrella definition. So I think this is also about moving forward, not necessarily saying, oh, we did something wrong and we have to start over. I think you can use what you already have. The last conceptual challenge that we have here is what to do with energy sharing. It is a right for both renewable and citizen energy communities, but it is not defined anywhere. And this does create challenges. It also creates opportunities. There could be a question of whether energy sharing just has to do with a more expanded concept of collective self-consumption. In the Renewable Directive, there are sort of two models for self-consumption that you can have for collective self-consumption. One could be that the de facto definition is more on a building level, but member states do have the discretion to expand the area for collective self-consumption. You see that in France. It's about 2 kilometers, it's either 2 or 3 kilometers in which this activity can take place. And in Greece, it's regionally based. So energy sharing, what is it? This could be the opportunity to say, well, we want to create a more we want to create, peer-to-peer trading platforms where you can trade not just renewable energy, but you can also trade your flexibility with each other. We already have an example of that in Austria, where you have a cooperatively owned peer-to-peer trading platform. But this could also just be about how you exchange benefits between members through the shared facilities. So there's not I don't think there should be any sort of dogma about what energy is, and I think energy sharing is, and this is one of the areas where it's very hard to go into technical details because the concept is very fuzzy, but that's kind of what we have. Maybe one of the last issues I would like to highlight is getting back to this coherence. So between the two definitions. At the beginning, I showed you this nice, clear picture. REC is a subset of CEC. Pardon my use of acronyms. But again, I said that's not necessarily true. And you can talk about the activities, whatnot, but with regard to the governance criteria, in 98% of the criteria, an REC is a subset of CEC, except for effective control. In that instance, an REC actually does go further than a CEC. So how do we maintain a coherence between the two? Because ultimately we want the concept to be clear for people who do want to use this. There are a couple of ways. One would just be to get rid of this, so move this into here. In terms of traditional transposition, this might get into some problems because it actually goes beyond the transposition. It's not to say that member states couldn't do it, but they would, if you're just talking about transposition, member states will only really be able to do this. I don't know if we can actually do anything about that. One way to deal with that though, and we are urging member states to think about adopting one single concept just to get rid of all of the confusion. And you could potentially do that. You could adopt the default definition, citizen energy community, and you could then say that an energy community who wants to adopt the additional criteria such as autonomy, such as local effective control, and focus only on renewables would then be eligible for additional privileges that are available to renewable energy community. This is an idea. Last, I think, no, it's not last, sorry. What to do if you do want to go beyond. So a lot of market actors are interested in this. The directive does not, the directives do not address all instances of community energy. Community energy is a very broad concept, and it can be either more developer, commercial developer-led, or more citizen-led. It's a broad spectrum, and the directives only focus on the core sort of ownership aspect of that. But what to do about partnerships with a commercial developer, what to do about industry that wants to create a similar concept. We personally, I'm just speaking for RESCU-BU, we are a little bit uncomfortable with this. To be honest, there are many concepts around citizen involvement that relate to active customers, renewable self-consumers, and even jointly acting that cover everybody. There are opportunities here. So our position is actually you don't need to label yourself as an energy community to benefit from the opportunities that people who are coming together, not as individuals, but collective, and not just collective, but for a community purpose. The directives were really about recognizing these. That's not to say that member states shouldn't continue to look at how to create models that sort of meld these, but what we would say is that these do need to be fairly distinct from these concepts. So if you are if you're thinking about developing a model for industry or industrial parks, this does need to be fairly distinct, not just in the way it's communicated, but also the way they benefit. Otherwise, it could create problems for competition, and it would also just kind of take away from the political significance of this. Lastly, again, I mentioned this already, is oversight. Who is going to oversee this? The definitions, the criteria, who meets them, how the criteria are maintained. In Ireland, they have adopted an auction monitor to ensure that all applicants who apply as an energy community remain an energy community. In Lithuania, they have in their draft law, they've said that the National Regulatory Authority should do this. I think this is not an easy question to answer. In the UK, cooperatives that do operate in the renewable energy sector have they are registered with the Financial Conduct Authority. So you might actually, at the end of the day, need some cooperation between regulatory authorities from maybe the commercial business sector and from the energy sector, because you do need somebody to look at what are the numbers, how are they developing, what is their impact on competition. So there might be some shared competencies or responsibilities between the authorities. These are the general recommendations that we have from everything I've told you. I think in the end of the day, we would encourage member states not to copy and paste. I think these principles are too vague and have too much potential to just be copied and pasted. There's a lot that needs to be done there so that the principles are more clear, and to prevent abuse, etc. Again, the definitions should be fairly flexible and open to different activities, expanding the opportunities for communities. Again, the relationship needs to be very clear between these two concepts at the national level, and they need to be clearly distinguished from activities themselves and other different models that might be developed. Again, look at the legal entities that you have in place. Maybe you shouldn't leave it open-ended, but maybe you want to keep it a little bit broader as well. And again, look at existing laws. There are company laws, cooperative laws, other laws of associations that can be used here. You don't have to start from scratch. I'm not going to go through these because I want to open it up, but you can just look at them and thank you for your attention. I'm sorry I went over, but now we have some time for discussion. So thank you. Okay, so maybe I should say how this works before we get into it. So basically what we wanted to have from this workshop, and it is fairly big, but I think it would be interesting to get views from yourselves. What is your position on the things that we have said? What are you seeing going on in the member states? What are the issues that you are facing or you see being a challenge? Is there something that we have not covered here that needs to be discussed? I really want this to be open and leave it to you just to sort of, give your perspectives on any of these issues. Or first, are there any questions? I don't want this to be a back and forth, so I want to limit that. If there are any questions.
Is it this one? No, that's the one that's there. No. It's the other one, the HD program. Did you have a little window showing what they are? This is what they see.
So where the state can be voting member. There are 3 categories. Companies, and local governments. The thing is, what is your suggestion about these 3 categories we need 4 in the definition? Because then you can choose basically one and still be compliant as a community. I know it's very far looked at, or very strictly interpreted, but you could also look at the definition of communication, which is the same. Logical, common, social, common, or economic. So, if I create jobs, great. I know it's very, it's not a discussion.
Sure, yeah, I mean, I think, not getting too, I mean, I would say the more important consideration here is openness. I mean, the concepts are fairly broad, so they are kind of inclusive of the 3 sort of members of society, I would say. You have the individual citizens, the local authorities, and the and businesses, whatever that may be. And maybe a good example, and this has been a concrete question, so like a Stadtwerke or public utility, right? Would that itself be an energy community? It is one legal entity. It does sort of bring the citizens in and it acts on their behalf. A lot of times it is subject to local authority control. Those local authorities can be voted in and out. Would this be an energy community? And again, this goes back to openness. I think the fact that these types of entities are not open would maybe say that this would not be an energy community. I mean, me personally, I'm not so worried if a local authority and a small business want to initiate an energy community in which local citizens come in. And I think this will differ depending on the member states. In a lot of Eastern European countries, I mean, for instance, in the Czech Republic or in Hungary, there's not a lot of expectation that citizens, at least in the initial stages, will be the drivers of this. They do think that it will be local authorities and local businesses coming together because they have the capital, they're a little bit more organized, and maybe the just way of working is just more, it's there. So, but maybe, in Belgium, for instance, you have a much more vibrant participatory culture of citizens, and therefore you might want to ensure that citizens are part of this. I don't think and this is where member states can be creative as well. Member states can, for instance, I don't see the problem if they wanted to put in minimum requirements for citizen participation, for instance. I'm not saying every member state should do this, but maybe some want to make sure that they are there. I mean, certainly this is what the initiative was for, but I think as long as they are open, obviously there's an issue of whether the minimum investment might be high. If it's 10,000 euros to get into an energy community, is that really open? I don't think so. But so I don't know if it's necessarily about prescribing that if it's just a local authority or a business, then, but certainly they should be encouraged. I think that's the most important. We should be encouraging all sort of segments of those to be. I mean, what is Rescue Planner's position on this, or even EcoPower?
We're still looking into all the options, but we're certainly in favor, I believe, of citizens being per se a member by default. Otherwise, you're not talking about community. But I can understand your logic as well. If a business or a community takes the lead first, but with the openness, of course, that allows the citizens as soon as possible to be there, then perhaps during some time frame, you could only have a few companies and a government being an energy community. But without the citizens, for us, on the long term at least, there is no such thing as the spirit of this idea. So we would, I think, oblige, as from the start, X amount percentage weight of citizens involved.
Actually, we state that the community should be open to citizens, otherwise it's not an energy community.
Like Josh, your face be close to the microphone for the people are asking about. Yeah.
I have a question regarding the alignment of the two definitions that I can see, where you speak of one umbrella definition. Now I'm wondering in which legislative act would this go in the member states, given the fact that the heating market is under-regulated or not regulated, and renewable energy communities can also operate on the heating market, which is not explicitly stated for 6.
Yeah, you raised a very good question. I'm glad you mentioned it. We actually had, so there have been questions about whether some entities that might, from an organizational perspective, look like an energy community, would they be an energy community? Because maybe they focus on gas, for instance. Gas isn't really covered. It is an overlap maybe between renewable energy communities and citizen energy communities, which is not addressed. We have asked the Commission about this, and I don't know if they have thought about this. I would argue that simply because an energy community has a different activity that is not covered doesn't mean it could not be an energy community. So for instance, if a citizen energy community supplies gas, like Shona, for instance, they supply gas. I mean, otherwise, I know you did a lot of research on that, so, but if they supply gas, should they be a citizen energy community? I don't see why they could not be. Where this becomes much more interesting, and I'm not sure this is a question that will last for very long, but you do have a strategy to sector couple. So, and in Denmark, district heating, the sector has, where a lot of people have been arguing around integrating renewable electricity into the district heating sector. Now, you've got a lot of wind, there's a big emphasis on trading it regionally, but a lot of the citizens there say, why are we trading this to our neighbors when we could just be storing it in our district heating facilities here? And it's a really good question. And then once that link is made, I'm not sure the distinction is so important anymore, because then a district heating plant is providing flexibility. They are interacting with the electricity market in a way. So then is it really that's like, then is the difference so much? I don't know. What do you think?
Well, I agree with the statement that it's not necessarily excluded that a citizen energy community also operates in the market. A possibility could be, well, in the Netherlands now, they are making an energy law, so they're merging the gas law, heating law, and electricity law. So that should prove an interesting pathway. Or you can also maybe copy paste the definitions into gas law. Could be possible solution. That's my view until now.
I think if you're integrating different sectors into one law, I think it makes even more sense to have one concept, right? Why, if one is trending towards one direction, why should this concept be trending in another direction? I think ultimately that could be confusing, but yeah, I mean, does the sorry to put you on the spot, but do you guys have any thoughts on this, Jan? Use the mic, please.
I think you're right in that our directives are not so clear on this. And I completely agree with your analysis that if we talk about sector integration, we need to think wider. And this will be more important and will become more important in the years to come. The only risk I see is when you go too wide, is that you really need to go to a very high degree of professionalization. So that by adding on lots of activities, you actually move away from the systems. This is something that I'm concerned about. So that you're right, the legal text is open. But I'd also like to thank you for the excellent work that you've done here. It's very, very interesting. And also the efforts that you spent in getting examples from member states of starting with implementation. Very useful. Can I already ask a question and go beyond the? Okay, because now there was a lot of focus on the definition, and I was wondering if you have also started looking at enabling frameworks of the directives, and if there's time at the end of this workshop, we could also look at
that. Yes, that is where the next session will cover, and I am absolutely sure we will not have time to cover everything. We tried to sandwich rights and enabling frameworks into one session, and I'm sorry in advance for that. So, I mean, I think I see this as an initial discussion as well. I think a lot of emphasis has gone into the definitions, I think importantly so, because before we get into technical and regulatory requirements, we definitely need to know what we are regulating in essence. But I really do, yeah, I look forward to sort of moving to that area. But yeah, that's a good point.
Okay, may I start? Do you want to start?
No, please.
Okay. So again.
Sorry, really quick. Maybe just at least in the first instance, just when you speak, identify yourself, because some people have come in since the introductions, and just state who you represent.
Okay, so Naomi from Solar Power Europe. So yeah, thanks for the presentation. It was super interesting. So really good work. Yeah, I mean, just maybe one remark. I think it's very true what you said on the to separate the concept of energy community from collective self-consumption. We have members that really want to defend the extended understanding of collective self-consumption beyond the sharing of energy within the building, and they use the tool of energy communities to promote that, which is a good thing. At the same time, it's not the same concept, so there is a lot of just a remark, something that I observed in the last month. I maybe have two questions or thoughts. How do you see more on the participation of companies, which may be, for example, a company that may be part of a big group that is there is a smaller installation in an area, and let's say they want to share energy in the local area with local other companies or universities, similar to what they do in Nantes, you know, with the university that shares energy with the local companies. So how do you see this kind of models fitting in the renewable energy community concept? And another thing is, you know, these crowdfunding things that we start to see on some projects where renewable energy developers open their crowdfunding platform, and citizens can participate. Yeah, they get basically return on investment from this fund. So how do you see this model fitting in these definitions? Would it be a good thing? Or not? Why?
Yeah, I mean, first on the collective self-consumption, I think it's a good question, and you're right. I think it comes from sort of maybe a misunderstanding of what you need to do in order to do a certain activity. A good example of this, though, is just look at what France is doing. I mean, France, their collective self-consumption, it started beyond the building level. So that is why that's one of the reasons why I put where is it? This here, right? Because collective self-consumption, it can be at building level. That's the minimum. But member states can expand it further, and that's exactly what France did. And they have already a law on renewable energy communities. They did not align the renewable energy community definition with their model of collective self-consumption, and they did that with the understanding that the two are not the same. Or maybe they didn't fully understand it, but I mean, if you talk to them, that's what they will. They do understand the difference there. So, and again, I think it's very important. Like the clean energy package has so many opportunities for everybody. Do you really want to be hand-tied by having to meet all of the renewable energy community criteria just because you want to develop a business model on collective self-consumption? It's not. I mean, these things are not necessarily about making money. So what? Like, is that really how we should be innovating? I would say not. Nobody would say that, that's very, like, I would almost call it like a Soviet-style planning. Everybody has to be this, we do it this way. That's not what we want. We want innovation. We want competition. We want different business models. So we don't want everybody doing energy communities. Otherwise, you're not going to get very far. I mean, it's really hard to answer sort of different collaborations between companies and different models. I mean, somebody actually who's probably online asked me the other day, if a municipality enters into an agreement and a third party installs solar on their rooftop, is that an energy community? And I would say, no, it's a very good initiative, but it's not an energy community. It can be covered under self-consumption because the directive says that a third party can be the installer and maintenance of the installation on your roof. And again, I always go back, does it meet the criteria? Are they establishing a legal entity, or is this more of a collaboration? Is this contract-based? Just because it's a legal entity doesn't mean it's an energy community. Maybe a university and businesses, they don't want to go through the big effort of setting up this whole thing. I think it really depends. And crowdfunding, this gets to, like, maybe a good example is Ireland again. So in their support scheme, they have dedicated support for community-led projects, but in their support scheme, they are also, for everybody that applies for support under the support scheme, they have to commit, I think it's 5% of their revenues to a community benefit fund. That is good, but it's not community, and it's not an energy community just because the local authority or the local area is getting some financial benefits from that. And I think that's where, there's nothing wrong with promoting crowdfunding, but crowdfunding is usually just investment. It has nothing to do with getting equity from your investment, getting a say in how the project is developed. So I think it's not that these initiatives should not be supported. And I think all of us in this room would say that we want to support these types of things, but is the energy community space, so to say, the right place to do it? I would say not, but I would put this in a category of supportive policies for supporting citizen involvement, really. Yeah, and maybe we can address this later, but I mean, another thing to say about this is like groundbreaking, historic, like nobody was, citizens were never even mentioned as active participants in the market before the clean energy package. So this will probably change, in the end as we get more experience, but this was really just the start. It's just sort of opening the door, and it can evolve over time as well. But it couldn't cover everything.
Okay, Emilio Sani from Italy. I would like just to point out a couple of my views on these items. The first one is this. It's true, the collective self-consumption is not limited to the energy communities. And if we look at the definition of active customer in the Electricity Renewable Directive, it is written that the active customer were permitted by member state may be also on other premises. But this is the key point, that there is a commitment of the member state to allow the collective self-consumption for the community. There is not a strict commitment of the member states to allow collective self-consumption. So this is why it's so important, the definition of the renewable energy communities, because we can force the member state in each of our states to implement the collective self-consumption for the energy communities, whilst the other one is a choice, and so it's more difficult. The second point that I believe is very important for the definitions is that to have three categories that I would say are the renewable energy communities, the citizen energy communities, and the possible collective self-consumption allows to have different benefits. Because many times when we had conversations with the ministries in Italy, it was told that if we must grant this to the renewable sources, we have to grant this also to cogeneration, and it becomes a mess. No, now there is the possibility to split the benefits that are granted to the different categories, because this is allowed expressly from the EU regulation, and I believe this is a second very important point. A third point is that I believe that we should have the broader interpretation about the categories of companies that may participate to the energy communities, because this may be know-how and this may support. But we must focus a lot on the scope of the energy community. So I believe that the key idea of the energy community is to reduce the cost of energy for the members, because it is within the energy directive, and because at the end this is the purpose that also in the recitals of the directive is written. So if this is the main purpose, at the end also the companies that want a profit, that participate to the community, may have advantages just to the extent that they reduce the cost of energy and will solve any kind of issue. So in the implementation in Italy, on the first implementation in Italy of this regulation, we are trying to focus on the fact that the main benefit from the energy community is the reduction of the cost of energy, because this solves all these issues. Because at the end, this grants the possibility to participate to all the citizens, and avoids that it becomes a company like another. And I finish with 3 points that I believe are not totally clear in the directives, and where I believe it would be interesting to know what is happening in the other countries. In Italy, I believe for a mistake in the translation, it is written that the renewable energy community must own the plant. In the English version is written owns the project. And there is a big difference, I believe, because in my idea, it's completely unnecessary that the renewable energy community has the ownership of the plant for the generation, but it may be a lease, it may be a gratuitous lease, there may be lots of different ways. And for the financing, this is very important, because it's harder for the citizens to have the possibility to pay all the capex immediately. So my understanding is that it is a mistake in the Italian translation, because both the French and the English version refer to ownership of the project and not of the plant, that is a different concept. So this is a the first item. Second item is that when I've listed the categories of possible members, there are the small and medium enterprises and the natural persons. There is not the reference to the third sector, no, to the associations not for profit. I believe they are included because my understanding is that we have to interpret the concept of small, medium enterprises in a very broad way. But the point has been raised, and so also on this, I believe it would be important to know what are the experience. Finally, I see the sharing as one of the key points, and in the recital 46 of the Electricity Directive, there is, I believe, an interesting interpretation of sharing, because it's written that there is the offset between the production of the community and the consumption of the members. But it is written, provided that both the meters are in the name of the community. And this is what is, I believe, a little bit contradictory, because one meter will be of the community, the production meter. But the meter of the customer will be in the name of the customer, because the customer must have the right to have its own supplier of energy. So I believe that it has to be interpreted in a broad way, in the sense that the member has to be member, the customer has to be member of the community.
And maybe we can talk about that later. We are running out of time here, but are there any more remarks? And in particular, I'd be interested in hearing. Yeah, there's one, but also maybe, maybe if any of the ministries that are here would like to say anything, or even the regulators. Are there issues that or concerns that you see with the implementation of these? What are you guys? What are you really grappling with right now?
Well, I want to make a remark about changes in Spain. For example, we said before that citizens have to be involved, otherwise it's something community. But for example, in Spain, the electro-intensive industry has to face very high prices, and that's hurting their competitiveness. So you could say, okay, they can do collective self-consumption. But if they are very vast industrial parks, covering an area bigger than 500 meters, they cannot, because there's a limitation of 500 meters. So energy communities could be an option for the
Not according to European legislation. But like Josh said at the beginning, I think it's a very important point. There might be initiatives that are worth supporting. They're great, they might have lots of benefits in all sorts of different ways for citizens, for companies, for industry, but they just don't meet the definition of what we're trying to propose to our.
Yeah, maybe just to respond to my question, would any of the regulators or ministries in the room like to say something before we break? You don't have to. I don't want to put you overly on the spot. Okay. Well, with that,
is there time? Because there was a question online.
Is there a question online? Okay. Yeah. Sure.
Can you ask the question? Yeah. People online? Can you unmute and ask your question? That's not working. Then there was a question about 13% ROI in Ireland. Can you explain a bit more?
13% why Ireland?
ROI in Ireland, return on investment. 13%. It's probably in your slides.
I think that is well in the. I mean, it's not totally clear, and there's probably somebody online that can explain this better than I can. But in the terms and conditions for the REC scheme and the citizen investment, they're kind of saying that they sort of scale it, so people who live within 3 kilometers of the project can get 13% return on investment in their investment in the community, and then people in the county or nationwide can get 8%. That is what I read. So again, this is just something I included because I saw it in the government's document, but perhaps it needs further clarification. But
okay.
that is what that is. Okay, let's break.
Now, my presentation will be introductory on writing applications and enabling framework. Now, you know, making distinction rights and enabling framework. We in the legislation you have this presented in different ways. You have in certain cases said well member states shall establish enabling framework, and in certain cases member states shall ensure that. Each time this brings us to national level, of course, these are directives. But you know, what's the difference between right and enabling framework? I would say right is immediate, it's direct. You can enforce it. You have a right to produce, full stop. That should be as such in the legislation. If it's not put in the legislation, a citizen might have a right to go to the court, to the national court, and say, come on, I have this right, it's not there. It should be in the legislation. It is sometimes expressed as a right as such in the directive, but you will see later sometimes it is expressed as part of definition. We're discussing, okay, is it a right? Yes, because if it is part of the definition, in a way that must happen for entity to function as it should. Enabling framework is more about conditions to set that things function properly. Now, we have this distinction, but on the other hand, I mean, for rights to be well, I mean, integrated, implemented, you also need things around. So it's not for implementation, you also need more probably than just putting a right in national legislation. Sometimes also, these things in an enabling framework, for example, third treatment, it can be expressed in the legislation as right, and me personally, I would very much encourage it to be expressed as a right. Now, this presentation will be about renewable and citizen energy community, because we talk about both. You will see that I concentrate more on renewables, because in enabling framework we decided to talk about things which are specific for a renewable energy community. Now, quickly, we have rights for renewable energy communities, which are for final consumers and for renewable for communities themselves. They are for final consumers. They are very much about the right to participate in communities, but also, you know, the way, I mean, they should not be subject to conditions which will prevent them from participation in a community. There is also a right to maintain the rights and obligations as final consumers, and this is coming very regularly in relation to members of communities. Now, renewable energy communities, as such, rights produce, consume, store, sell, share, and access energy markets. As I said, I personally think that some parts of the enabling framework should also be translated as rights in national legislation. In relation to citizen energy communities, again, this what I said, right from the definition, and then specific right expressed as such. So member states shall ensure that, and you have access to electricity markets. You have also obligation, which was not mentioned in the renewable directive,
for renewable energy communities, but de facto it is in the electricity regulation, so it's not that it does not exist, it was just not mentioned in this place. So you have two, let's say, things very much related to access to the market. Then you have non-discriminatory treatment. You have also, well, something I should mention probably at the beginning, arrangement of sharing of electricity, its own electricity, so produced by production units owned by the community within the community, and also again self-generated electricity to be treated for self-generated generated electricity to be treated as in the same way as for active customers. Now, enabling framework. And the enabling framework for renewable energy communities and citizen energy communities, I would say they are not expressed in the same way. We will concentrate, I will concentrate here on elements which are specific for renewable energy communities. I would call this enabling framework, I would define it enabling framework for renewable energy communities as something to set conditions for communities to start function, to encourage their existence, and also I see them having a certain role because you have, for example, vulnerable consumers mentioned. You have almost acknowledgement that that there might need more push because you have this assessment of barriers and potential and requirement to remove barriers. You have also special role and of public authorities acknowledged here, which are not mentioned as such in relation to citizen energy as I said, in relation to renewable energy communities, I will concentrate here on barriers and potential, on role of public participants, public authorities, and on low-income and vulnerable customers. Now, enabling framework for citizen energy communities, in addition to the different character, which I just mentioned, ensuring level playing field for citizen energy communities and promoting development at national level for renewable energy communities. I found it also interesting, this obligatory and non-obligatory elements mentioned here. In obligatory elements, you have all this related to participation membership in the community, which were already mentioned by Josh in some cases in relation to definitions. So, you know, they're made strong here. Participation is open, voluntary. You can leave, and you do not lose rights. Again, something I mentioned before. You don't lose rights and obligations as household customer or active customer if you are a member of citizen energy community. There is also cooperation with DSO, which was also the case in both cases. There is in relation to renewable energy communities and citizen energy communities, this cooperation with DSO is mentioned. In this case, it's interesting that it's stressed that it's subject to fair compensation. And non-obligatory elements are
maybe I would say it might be that related to the fact they are seen differently as renewables, because you have mentioned here this cross-border cooperation. You have mentioned here ownership, establishment, purchase, lease, distribution networks. So this is also kind of linked to the character, how they are perceived as such. Now, assessment of assessment and removal of barriers. This is something mentioned in relation to renewable energy communities. Its assessment as such is mentioned in the paragraph just before the enabling framework. There's no time frame mentioned in relation to that. Does it mean that it can happen anytime? I would argue that it should happen before transposition. If you, in transposition, in the enabling framework, you have to address the barriers, obviously. I mean, you must know, what barriers you address. So the fact that it's stated that there's no date does not mean anything. I think it should be treated as part of transposition. How do you transpose it? Because, I mean, what do? You put, I remove this barrier, or what do you do? I think there should be at least indication of this assessment obligation. It should be in the legislation. There should be a body indicated who's responsible for that. I don't think it should be one-off exercise. So there should be this assessment carried on regular basis. But in addition, I think that the barriers already have to be assessed and addressed, which can be, I mean, you don't detect it necessarily like that. I don't know how the national laws are presented when you make a proposal. I know that when Commission is making a proposal, you always have this explanatory note. So this can be addressed there, just for for people knowing how it is addressed. Now there are good practice examples. In UK, some years ago, there was consultation on UK community energy strategy. There was a time allocated to that, and then the strategy really addressed the barriers and how they are to be solved, and what has to be done with them. In Portuguese law, recently adopted, we also know that then there's an obligation on a specific body to make an assessment. They are given 2 years for that, and then they are to do this assessment then regularly every 3 years. The other element of the energy framework in relation to renewable energy communities are low-income and vulnerable households. And I mean, for me, it is like an acknowledgement that there is a role for renewable energy to be treated as a tool to fight or to address the energy poverty. Recycle also mentioned an assessment. It's in Recycle of renewable energy directive, so it's not in the main text, but they should be taken as a guidance, and I think it would be useful guidance for member states to make an assessment of how to enable vulnerable consumers. It's interesting, it's not only owners, but also tenants, which we know that there is always this tenant tension. There are good practice examples in US. I know that in Greece there are also some attempts to address it. We know that it's very often like I mean, the solution, in many countries, there are subsidies, or maybe, I don't know, there are subsidies like financial help granted for vulnerable households, so paying energy bills. Is it a solution on the long term? And in Greece, we know that Greenpeace was addressing this issue, trying to find a solution where you could either have energy efficiency measures or renewable, so photovoltaic panels that could be put for free, and then there are different options that they would benefit on a longer term. So in a way, because paying each time the energy bill is not really a solution. Then there's capacity building for local authorities. It's again there is kind of natural relationship between energy communities and local authorities. They often want to participate. In many cases, they don't have resources. That requires technical expertise. That requires legal expertise. That requires financial capacities. You know, you have projects, you have communities, or local entities where this can be used also. Participation in community can be, in a way, almost a source of revenue. So this is acknowledged as a need to address. I mentioned Redbook model of cooperation. I think we are organizing it together here. So well, looking at them when they identify, develop, finance projects, have to mobilize the funds within the local authority, but it needs to be addressed. It needs to be addressed in more structural way. There is a commitment by the government in Ireland recently to set a system of trusted intermediaries, mentors, trusted advisors, providing financial support and information points, which is the step in this direction. And it leads to contact points, information on renewable energy communities and point of contact. These are basically three places in directives where you have this kind of provisions on information providing, and these are in relation to renewable energy communities. There's one thing, information to citizens, so Article 18. There's an obligation providing guidance, information, awareness raising. It's more general, it's not for communities. But there's one paragraph which deals with benefits of, puts this activity of information also on benefits and practicalities of developing and using energy from renewable sources, including technical and financial aspects. So there is an obligation to provide information and specific information for renewable energy communities, but there's also an article about permit granting process. And in this article, there is a requirement of setting contact points. These two, that would make sense to put them together. But if we have two together, why not putting three? Under electricity directive, there is also an article which is quite general compared to the other ones concerning points of contact. They should be providing information on citizens' rights, on current legislation, means of dispute settlement. Again, it's not specific to communities, but I think it would make much sense to have all these things merged together. I mean, as a simple citizen, I mean, I know how difficult it is to get information. So this is where I am, and now I
Okay. Yeah, so we're just kind of, we combined 3 people to do this because it's quite a big presentation and we all have our respective focuses within the report that we are doing. I'm going to focus now on, so Marta kind of focused on the elements just now on information provision and technical advice. This is one of, what? You didn't combine it?
No, it's
Okay. Mine.
Is it picture?
Having definition at the very end. Very end. We are lawyers, not technical specialists. Technology. Yes, this is it. Yeah. So the element that Marta just described sort of gives half of the piece, which is really about capacity building for citizens to come together to create renewable energy projects. What she talked about was the provision of technical advice, but the other side to that coin is access to financial tools. So what is access to financial tools? You can see from a very developed practice in member states, there are several tools that have been used by member states or local authorities to provide finance for communities. This is not so much about providing like operational support. So once you get your project up and running, how you get revenues from that. What the access to financial tools is really about is giving citizens access like more upfront finance so that they can do some of the tasks that are more difficult to raise finance around. One of the very typical things you will hear from a community project is that if they want to put up a wind park, how do you get finance to do feasibility studies or planning or get technical and legal advice? These are not things that communities are well suited to finance upfront. So a lot of governments have put in place financial mechanisms to de-risk these types of activities for communities so that they can go forward. A really good example, and to be honest, it's no coincidence that we are here at the Scotland House. They have a very strong tradition of community energy. And one thing that they have developed is called the CARES. I call it the CARES Fund, but it's really a CARES program. It actually combines a lot of technical expertise. You can go to an online access point. It's run by a local NGO in Scotland, and there you get access to peer advice, but you can also get access to different financing schemes, everywhere from you can get a grant to do a feasibility study. If the feasibility goes forward, you can get a very beneficial loan, and there are even innovation grants, and it's all very simple to access. And in the UK, you have other funds that were dedicated for specific areas. You have an urban fund, a rural community fund. In Ireland, they've also combined their renewable support scheme with these elements to give communities the ability to access technical advice and upfront financing so that they know if they have a project to go forward. And that is actually a big challenge in participating in support schemes. If you have to participate in an auction, but you have to put money in just to get the project, to see whether you have a project or not, it might never go forward because that's a sunk cost that you will never see again. So being able to de-risk that is very important. And this is also taking place in Denmark, where they put in place, they can range anywhere from around 65,000 euros to even 500 or 300,000 euros. It's also no coincidence that some of the countries that have developed these are also the leaders in community energy so far. There are also other tools around encouraging individual investment. I bring an example from the UK. It doesn't exist anymore because the Conservative government got rid of it a couple of years ago, but it essentially was an incentive for individuals to invest in social enterprises, and they could offset that investment off of their personal tax liability. And it was almost like a top incentive to get people interested in investing in renewable energy cooperatives. It was very effective. And then there are also just low interest loans. You see this for district heating, for various projects. These are very, very useful in encouraging the investments to go forward. And one thing I would say is connecting it back to the one-stop shop and even to energy poverty and vulnerable customers, providing upfront finance for them to be able to join, or reducing requirements for them to join. These can be very interesting tools. So there is an interlink, and again, these can be advertised or linked with the one-stop shops, which are really to simplify project processes for projects and to give them advice. So this is next. I'm going to go quite briefly, hopefully, into more of how to enable communities to actually get involved in the market. There are two aspects to this, and I'm just combining them for ease. One is about not being having a right to be treated in a non-discriminatory manner. But there's also a provision in both directives around fair, proportionate, and transparency licensing and registration procedures and charges. The reason I put them together is because I see one as a more practical extension of the other. Of course, everybody has the right to non-discriminatory treatment, but what does that actually mean in the lens of the EU legal principle of equality? And what we say as cooperatives is that like things must be treated likely, similarly, and not like things must be treated differently. And so how that looks in terms of regulations or responsibilities, or even how responsibilities are met, is very important. And this is why you see specific language on licensing and registration, because often these are big administrative or substantive hurdles for communities to get involved in different activities. So, but what does that actually mean? Here you have, this is what we are saying. These are concrete examples of how you can do proportionate procedures. So first, one, you could differentiate. If the challenge is sufficient enough, and the need is there's a basis for the need, you can set different rules for energy communities vis-a-vis other market participants. One aspect where that has already been implemented is in Greece's community energy legislation, where it does prioritize grid connections for communities above other grid connections. Ireland is also testing this out. I think they're going to start with 15 projects and see how it goes. Another example of this, which is already included in the electricity regulation, is balancing responsibility. They allow member states to exempt generation installations below 400 kilowatts from needing to have balancing responsibility. This is a very important way that you can level the playing field for smaller generators and communities in particular. Where you can't simply differentiate, you can reduce or simplify burdens. So you're still applying the responsibility, but maybe you're making it a little less stringent to meet, or you're tailoring it in a way that is not overly complicated for the community to meet it. We can contextualize this in Greece, where guarantees for reduction are reduced by 50%, or they are exempt from annual generation license fees, or to become a licensed supplier, they lower the minimum capital that you must have. After that, it's about flexibility. So the regulator says, okay, we can't just exempt you, but we will let you meet an obligation or responsibility in a different way, because we are looking at your characteristics as a non-commercial market actor, and we see that you might need some special consideration. Another way of doing that is, again, in the electricity regulation, where everybody must de facto have balancing responsibility, but you can also delegate this responsibility to a third party. This is going to be very important for energy communities, because balancing responsibility is it's a very strong obligation. Most cooperatives are not able to meet this. They will delegate this. Financial solvency, also, to become a supplier. How you demonstrate to the regulator that you have enough money to make sure that you're not going belly up and leaving consumers in a lurch. A lot of our members have expressed that simply by having to provide a high guarantee, this can be difficult, but they have suggested other ways in which they might be able to meet these requirements. So this can be explored. And then lastly, capacity building support. So we say, okay, we have, either we've been able to simplify or differentiate, or we can't do anything because this is just too strong of a requirement that we need to keep in place. Giving communities a contact point. So whether this is through the regulator or through the ministry, basically laying out, on their website or having a dedicated desk saying, we will help you navigate the regulatory hurdles of becoming a licensed supplier. And one aspect where I think a combination of these will be needed is for energy sharing, collective self-consumption. A lot of people ask, okay, you're going to be supplying, you need a supply license. Now you have a lot smaller actors. Supply licenses have traditionally been designed around large centralized suppliers of generators. So we're going to need to tailor that moving on. Okay, that's all I have to say about that, and this is the last transition we have.
Okay, so leading on from what Josh has been talking about, their treatment of energy communities, I'm going to talk about the cost-benefit analysis processes that are included in legislation to ensure that distributed energy resources that are being provided by these energy communities are properly valued. And also I'll begin by talking about tariff design and how that fits into the cost-benefit analysis requirement. And then I'll go on to a discrete different topic, which is the framework around what the discretion member states have to introduce a framework for community-owned, community-operated networks. So beginning with tariff design, tariffs are obviously a very important part of the incentive environment for energy communities. And Article 18 of the electricity regulation includes a bunch of competing requirements around tariff design. One of the key ones that is new from the previous electricity regulation is that tariffs should support flexibility. Tariffs are, as many of you know, they sit on a kind of spectrum of more fixed, one end being more fixed and one being more variable. The three headline tariffs are basically fixed tariff, which is the same amount being charged at a given point of delivery. A capacity tariff, whereby the charge is given per meg. Sorry, I've got that around the wrong way in the slide. The charge for a capacity tariff would be per megawatt, and a volumetric tariff where it's charged by volume, so per megawatt hour. Climate did analysis this year of the different requirements under the Clean Energy Package around tariff design, and we came to the view that a volumetric time of use tariff is one that will probably support a lot of those competing requirements in the legislation, and it's also it tends to be viewed as quite a favourable tariff for supporting flexibility, and that is very relevant for the environment that energy communities will be operating within. Several countries are now looking at differentiated kinds of tariffs for energy communities. So in these countries that are considering those tariffs are Portugal, Austria, France, and also Wallonia in Belgium. And basically the idea there would be that the tariffs would reflect the impact of the energy community on reducing the grid system costs. That would be marginal loss factors, local supply and consumption, and also reduced use of the transmission grid. But obviously that kind of tariff would need to take into account any continued reliance on the transmission grid that that energy community would have. And another type of differentiated tariff is one that's currently being used in a Schirnship regulatory sandbox in the Netherlands, and that is basically providing remuneration to that community for avoided grid costs that are delivered through the energy sharing and the demand response that's being undertaken by that new project. And that has allowed the DSO to connect that community of, I think, 105 residences at half the capacity that they would otherwise have required, so huge savings there. And there's more information about that in the Horizon Bridge project. So the potential use, the Horizon Bridge project paper on energy communities. So these differentiated local tariffs for energy communities reflect part of that broader scheme for ensuring that the costs and benefits of energy communities are properly reflected and incorporated into the incentive and regulatory environment in which they're going to be operating. And we have in the Electricity Directive and also the Renewable Energy Directive the requirement that national authorities conduct cost-benefit analyses in relation to the benefits of the distributed energy resources provided by energy communities. That is energy communities and also renewable energy communities. And that is in order to ensure that they contribute in an adequate, fair and balanced way to the overall cost sharing of the system, which makes sense given that these are new entrants whose value to the system should be properly evaluated. There's no guidance provided in legislation as to how to conduct that cost-benefit analysis. So in the report that we're preparing, I've looked at the New York's Reforming the Energy Vision project, and as part of that program, as part of that, there was an order developed that included some key principles that should be considered in conducting a cost-benefit analysis for distributed energy resources. So these are firstly to base the analysis on transparent assumptions and methodologies that list all the benefits and costs, including those that are localized and more granular. That would include accounting for externalities that are caused by emissions that aren't reflected in the wholesale price of electricity. It would also include socio-political values. So these could be things like social cohesion, community building, distributive justice, democracy. The economic values being energy savings, and as Josh mentioned earlier, in terms of the values that these contribute to local communities. Also the return on investment for local citizens as well. And in terms of environmental values, they could be lower pollution and mitigation of climate change to the extent that renewable energy resources are used in the project or by the community. The second principle is to avoid combining or conflating different values and costs to ensure that an accurate analysis is completed. The third is to assess portfolios rather than discrete individual projects or investments. And that allows for consideration of potential synergies and economies. So for instance, energy communities will probably be increasingly capable of conducting aggregation and providing aggregation services, as well as P2P trading and self-consumption, which will all eventually become more significant contributors to grid reliability. And that should be properly reflected in the analysis that's done for distributed energy resources. The fourth is to address the full lifetime of the investment. And the fifth is to compare the costs and the benefits to traditional forms of energy generation rather than just valuing them in isolation. So that should, for example, take into account the emissions that would have been released in a more traditional form of energy generation. So the outcomes of the cost-benefit analysis for distributed energy resources should inform the setting of charges, including network tariffs, that apply to energy communities. So the last topic I'll talk about is the possibility for community-owned networks. The Electricity Directive provides an option and a discretion to member states to allow the development and enabling framework for citizens' energy communities to own or lease their distribution networks and manage them. There are two types of community-owned networks that are envisioned under that directive. one being a closed network and the other being a public network. A closed network is basically one that is exempt from certain different kinds of administrative requirements, and they tend to be taken, they do exist, not a citizen's version of it, but they do exist and they tend to be used by sort of specialised private or industrial undertakings. For example, hospitals and airports. The things that they might be exempt from are tariff, the requirement to obtain approval around tariff setting, tariff methodology, and also they are exempt from the ban that normally applies to DSOs on developing their own storage and electric vehicle charging systems. So these kinds of closed distribution networks can do that kind of stuff. So if a citizens' energy community is granted the status of, if it's enabling a framework is applied and they are able to gain the status of being basically a distributed system operator, they're then to be treated, subject to what I just said about closed distribution networks, they're then to be treated as subject to the same obligations that would normally apply to a DSO. And that would include things like unbundling.